What would you do if everything you built suddenly pushed you away? Imagine this moment. A man sits alone in a quiet room. No applause, no cheers, no cameras, just silence. Outside, the world still sees him as a genius. Inside, he feels empty. This man is Steve Jobs, and today he is not the hero you know. He has just been fired. Fired from the company he created. Fired from the dream he carried in his heart since he was a young boy. Fired from Apple. The same Apple that would one day change the world. But not today. Today, Steve feels confused. He feels embarrassed. He feels broken. People are talking. Newspapers are writing headlines. Whispers follow him everywhere. How could this happen? How can the founder be removed? What kind of man loses his own company? Steve walks slowly. His mind is heavy. His thoughts are loud. He remembers the long nights, the ideas, the fights, the passion. And now, it's all gone. He doesn't know who he is anymore. Was he really talented, or was it all luck? Was he a leader, or just a difficult man who pushed too hard? Failure doesn't knock gently. It crashes into your life. And when it comes, it doesn't only take your job, it takes your confidence, your identity, your sense of purpose. Steve Jobs had fame. He had money. But in this moment, none of it mattered. Because success cannot protect you from failure. The truth is uncomfortable. The man who created Apple was once thrown out of his own company. This story does not begin with victory. It begins with loss. It begins with a man who feels small, a man who feels forgotten, a man standing at the edge of his own future, unsure if he can begin again. And tonight, as we tell this story slowly, quietly, honestly, remember this. This is not a story of success. This is a story of failure, and how failure changed everything. Long before Steve Jobs stood on big stages, long before Apple became a symbol of innovation, he was just a baby, quietly placed into someone else's arms. Steve Jobs was adopted. From the very beginning, his life started with a question he couldn't answer. Why was I given away? His adoptive parents loved him deeply. They cared for him. They supported him. But still, somewhere inside his young heart, a silent feeling lived. A feeling of being different. A feeling of not fully belonging. As a child, Steve often wondered about his real parents. He didn't speak about it much, but the thought stayed with him. Maybe that is why he asked so many questions. Maybe that is why he looked at the world so closely. He grew up in California, in a simple neighborhood. Nothing special, no signs of greatness. But Steve's mind was always busy. He liked to open things, radios, old machines, anything with wires and buttons. He didn't just want to use things, he wanted to understand them. While other children played outside, Steve sat quietly, taking things apart. Sometimes he broke them. Sometimes he fixed them. Failure didn't scare him then. It was part of learning. His father taught him an important lesson. If you build something, build it well, even the parts no one sees. This idea stayed with Steve forever. At school, Steve didn't feel special. He wasn't the best student. He wasn't the most popular. Teachers saw him as difficult, restless, bored. But inside, his imagination was alive. He loved calligraphy. He loved art. He loved beauty and simplicity. Things that didn't seem useful. Things that didn't fit into normal education. Steve didn't know his future.
He didn't see success ahead of him. He was not confident. He was not certain. He was just a curious boy trying to understand the world and trying to understand himself. He didn't know that his questions would become his strength. He didn't know that his feeling of being different would one day shape everything he created. At this moment in his life, there were no answers, only curiosity, only a quiet hope, and a young boy looking at the world, wondering where he truly belonged.
As Steve Jobs grew older, the questions inside him did not disappear. They became louder. After high school, there was an expectation: go to college, study, get a degree, build a safe future. So Steve did what many young people do. He followed the path laid out in front of him. He went to college. At first, everything felt exciting. New people, new ideas, a new beginning. But soon, the excitement faded. Steve sat in classrooms, listening to lectures that felt empty to him. He looked around and wondered why he was there. He didn't feel connected. He didn't feel inspired. Worse than that, he felt guilty. College was expensive. His parents were working hard to support him, and Steve felt like he was wasting their money. Every day, a quiet fear followed him. What if I'm doing the wrong thing? What if I don't belong here? He tried to ignore it. He tried to fit in, but the feeling stayed. At night, Steve lay awake staring at the ceiling. His mind moved faster than his body. Thoughts raced, doubts grew. And then, one day, he made a decision. Steve Jobs dropped out of college. Not because he was brave, not because he had a clear plan, but because he was confused. Because staying felt more wrong than leaving. Dropping out was not freedom. It was fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of failure, fear of disappointing everyone. Steve didn't suddenly become confident. He didn't feel proud. He felt lost. Without the structure of college, his life felt unstable. No schedule, no direction. He slept on friends' floors. He returned bottles to get money for food. Sometimes he didn't know how he would eat. Yet in this uncertainty, something unexpected happened. Steve began to follow his curiosity again. He attended classes that interested him, not for grades, not for a degree, just because they felt meaningful. One of those classes was calligraphy. At the time, it seemed useless. Beautiful letters, careful spacing, no future, no job. But Steve didn't know that this useless class would one day change how millions of people read and see words. Right now, though, he was just a dropout. No title, no plan, only fear and a quiet belief that somehow following what felt right might lead somewhere.
After leaving college, Steve Jobs didn't step into a clear future. He stepped into uncertainty. He was young, confused, still searching for direction. Then, he met someone who would change everything. Steve Wozniak. Woz was different from Steve. Quiet, brilliant, a true engineer. Where Steve had vision, Woz had technical magic. They shared something important, a love for electronics, a belief that technology could be personal. At that time, computers were big, expensive, only for companies and universities. Steve looked at them and thought, what if regular people could use them? There was no office, no investors, no fancy tools, just a small garage. The garage belonged to Steve's parents. It smelled like dust and old machines. The floor was cold. The lights were dim. They worked late into the night, soldering wires, testing parts, fixing mistakes. Sometimes things worked. Often they didn't. Money was a constant problem. Steve sold his car. Woz sold his calculator. They didn't talk about success. They talked about survival. Yet even in that small space, big ideas were growing. Steve believed deeply in simplicity. Technology should feel friendly. It should feel human. He pushed hard, sometimes too hard, but he could see something others couldn't. Late at night, when the world was quiet, Steve imagined the future. Homes with computers, people creating, learning, connecting. At the same time, doubt never fully left him. What if no one cared? What if they failed? There were moments of silence, moments when the garage felt heavy. But hope lived there too. In 1976, they built their first computer. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. They called it Apple. The name was simple, friendly, different. Success didn't arrive with noise. It arrived quietly. A few orders, some interest, small steps forward. Steve didn't celebrate. He focused. The garage was not glamorous, but it was honest. It was a place where ideas mattered more than titles, where belief mattered more than money. Steve Jobs was still not famous, still not rich, but something had begun. A company born from curiosity, from long nights, from a small room filled with big dreams. And without knowing it, Steve was walking toward both his greatest success and his greatest failure.
Apple didn't grow slowly forever. One day, it exploded. Orders increased, attention followed. People started to notice. Steve Jobs was no longer just a young man in a garage. He was a founder, a leader, a rising star in Silicon Valley. The company grew fast, too fast. New employees arrived. Offices replaced the garage. Investors brought money and pressure. And with success came change. Steve loved control. He cared deeply about every detail, design, words, feel. But as Apple grew, so did his intensity. Meetings became tense. His voice became sharper. His expectations became heavier. Steve wanted perfection, nothing less. If something wasn't right, he said it. If someone disappointed him, he showed it. Some admired his passion. Others feared his temper. He could inspire a room and moments later crush confidence with a sentence. Inside Steve, something was shifting. Success fed his ego. People listened to him now. The media praised him. His ideas were celebrated. And slowly, quietly, humility faded. He began to believe that he was always right, that his vision mattered more than people. Conflicts grew. Executives argued with him. Engineers felt pressured. The atmosphere changed. Steve didn't see it clearly. In his mind, he was protecting Apple, fighting for quality, defending the future. But others saw a different man. Difficult, unpredictable, hard to work with. Apple released successful products. The company became famous. But inside, cracks were forming. Steve pushed his team beyond limits. He demanded loyalty without question. He expected sacrifice without hesitation. The same passion that built Apple was now creating distance. Steve was young, inexperienced as a leader, unaware of his own flaws. He thought success meant control, that strength meant never bending. He didn't know that leadership requires listening, and that vision without empathy creates resistance. At this moment, Apple looked strong from the outside, but inside, tension was rising. And quietly, behind closed doors, decisions were being discussed. Decisions that would change Steve Jobs' life forever. He didn't see it coming. He didn't imagine that the company he loved was beginning to push him away. The room was quiet. Too quiet. Steve Jobs sat at the long table,
surrounded by people he once trusted, executives, board members, faces that avoided his eyes. This was not a creative meeting. This was not about ideas. This was about power. Apple was changing. The company was growing larger than Steve himself, and many believed he was no longer the right person to lead it. Steve felt it before anyone spoke. The tension, the distance, the cold air between words. Arguments had been building for months. His leadership style, his temper, his refusal to compromise. Some said he was impossible to work with. Others said he was holding Apple back. Steve defended himself. He spoke with passion, with fire. This company was his life, his identity. He didn't know how to separate himself from Apple. But the room had already decided. Votes were taken. Conversations ended. And then the words came. Steve Jobs was removed from his role. The company he helped create no longer wanted him. For a moment, time stopped. Steve felt his chest tighten, his thoughts blurred. This wasn't just losing a job, this was losing himself. Outside the room, the world moved on. Inside Steve, something broke. The news spread quickly. Newspapers wrote headlines. People whispered, "How could this happen? How does someone get fired from their own company?" Public failure feels different. It doesn't stay private. It follows you. Steve felt embarrassed, humiliated. He had been praised, now he was rejected. He walked away from Apple with money, yes, but money felt meaningless. What he lost was deeper. Purpose, pride, belonging. At night, Steve stared into darkness. The silence was loud. Questions filled his mind. Was I wrong? Was I too much? Was I never good enough? For the first time, Steve doubted himself deeply. He had built Apple with obsession and belief, and now that same obsession had pushed him out. Failure stripped away his confidence. He felt exposed, vulnerable. Friends didn't know what to say. Enemies stayed silent. The man once seen as unstoppable now felt small. Steve later said this was the hardest moment of his life, because when success leaves you suddenly, you are forced to face who you really are. And Steve didn't like what he saw. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a genius. He was just a man who had lost everything that mattered to him. This was not a lesson yet, not growth, not wisdom. This was pain. Raw, real, unavoidable. And as Steve Jobs walked away from Apple, he had no idea if he would ever recover. After leaving Apple, Steve Jobs disappeared from the spotlight. No interviews, no applause, no big stages, just quiet days and heavy nights. For the first time in years, Steve had nowhere to go in the morning. No meetings, no teams waiting for his decisions. The silence was uncomfortable. When your whole identity is taken away, even rest feels painful. Steve felt empty. He had money, he had freedom, but neither could fill the space inside him. Success had once protected him from his fears. Now those fears returned, louder than ever. He questioned everything: his talent, his past decisions, his worth. Some days he stayed alone for hours, thinking, replaying conversations, hearing old arguments in his head. Fame fades quickly when failure arrives. People stopped calling. Invitations disappeared. The world moved on, and Steve felt forgotten. Depression settled in quietly. Not dramatic, not loud, just a slow, heavy feeling that made even simple tasks difficult. He felt ashamed. ashamed of his ego, ashamed of his mistakes, ashamed of who he had become. At night, the thoughts were worst. When the world sleeps, your mind speaks. Steve wondered if Apple was better without him, if his ideas truly mattered. He thought about walking away from technology completely. Starting over felt impossible. He had failed publicly, and public failure leaves scars. But in this darkness, something small remained, a quiet curiosity, a question that refused to disappear. What can I learn from this? It wasn't hope yet, it wasn't confidence, just a tiny opening. Failure had humbled him, stripped him of arrogance. For the first time, Steve was forced to listen to himself. Pain slowed him down. Silence taught him patience. He didn't know it yet, but this darkness was shaping him, breaking him, so that something new could form. And slowly, very slowly, Steve Jobs began to think about starting again, from nothing.
Starting again is never easy. Starting again after public failure is even harder. Steve Jobs stood at the edge of a new beginning, but this time he moved differently, more quietly, more carefully. He didn't rush back into the spotlight. Instead, he asked himself a simple question: what do I really want to build? From that question, a new company was born. He called it Next. The name itself showed hope, not the past, the future. Next was not a fast success. There were no headlines, no applause. Steve focused on quality again, but now with patience. He listened more. He argued less. The mistakes from Apple stayed with him. They reminded him to slow down. Next computers were beautifully designed, powerful, elegant, but they were expensive, too expensive. Sales were slow. Another version of Steve might have exploded with anger. This time, he accepted reality. Failure was no longer an enemy. It was a teacher. Around the same time, another unexpected opportunity appeared. Steve bought a small animation studio from George Lucas. It was called Pixar. At first, Pixar struggled. Money problems, unclear direction. Many thought it was a bad investment. But Steve believed in the people. Not control, not ego. People. He learned to trust creative teams, to support rather than dominate. Years passed quietly. Pixar worked patiently, carefully. Then one day, everything changed. Pixar released a movie, Toy Story. The world loved it, not because of technology, but because of heart. Pixar became successful slowly, honestly. Steve didn't rush to take credit. He stayed in the background. This was a different man. At Next, progress was slow but meaningful. The technology they built was advanced. It didn't sell widely, but it mattered. Steve was learning a new lesson. Success without wisdom is fragile. Failure, when accepted, creates depth. He was no longer chasing applause. He was chasing understanding. Building became joyful again, not driven by fear, not fueled by ego, just love for creation. Steve Jobs was growing, quietly. And somewhere else, far away, Apple was struggling. Time passed. Years moved on, and without Steve Jobs, Apple slowly lost its direction. The company released products that confused people. Too many ideas, no clear vision. Sales dropped. Confidence faded. The company Steve once built was now struggling to survive. Inside Apple, conversations began again. Quiet ones at first, then serious ones. There was a name that kept returning:
Steve Jobs, the same man they once pushed away. When the call finally came, Steve didn't feel excitement. He felt fear. Fear of repeating the past. Fear of failing again. Fear of facing the people who once rejected him. Returning to Apple was not a victory. It was a risk. He walked through the doors slowly. The building felt familiar and strange. Memories returned. The good, the painful. People looked at him differently now, not as a young, difficult founder, but as a man shaped by loss. Steve didn't take full control immediately. He observed. He listened. Apple was close to collapse. Instead of anger, Steve felt clarity. The company didn't need more products. It needed focus. He made hard decisions, but calmly. He simplified everything. Less noise, more purpose. There was still doubt around him. Some questioned his return. Some remembered his past behavior. Steve understood. Trust had to be rebuilt. Slowly, quietly. He was no longer trying to prove himself. He was trying to save something he loved. This time, Steve wasn't leading with ego. He was leading with experience, with humility, with pain. And in that pain, there was strength. Apple's future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, there was direction. And Steve Jobs stood once again at the center of Apple, not as the same man, but as someone deeply changed. Returning to Apple changed Steve Jobs, but not overnight. The man who once demanded absolute control, who shouted, who pushed, who burned bridges, was different now. Pain had reshaped him. Failure had taught him lessons no success ever could. His focus sharpened, not on proving himself, but on creating products that mattered. The first thing he did was simplify. Apple's cluttered lines of products vanished. Confusing models disappeared. He wanted clarity, elegance, purpose. Design became everything. Not just how it looked, but how it felt, how it worked for people. He still had passion, still had vision, but it was no longer tied to ego. It was tied to the user, the experience, the heart of the product. One of his first successes was the iMac, a computer that looked different, friendly, beautiful. People noticed. They smiled when they saw it, and slowly trust returned. Jobs also began investing in small ideas that would grow quietly. The iPod was born, a device that would change how people listened to music. Behind these products, Steve had learned patience. He allowed teams to create. He allowed mistakes. He allowed growth. The controlling, abrasive leader was still there sometimes, but he had learned to temper it, to pick battles wisely, to inspire instead of intimidate. Steve Jobs became a leader people wanted to follow, not because of fear, but because of vision, because of clarity, because of purpose. He had grown from failure, from rejection, from embarrassment. The world saw the success, but behind the scenes, it was quiet transformation. A man who once feared losing everything now led with wisdom. He understood that greatness wasn't just about creating products, it was about creating people, about creating a culture, about creating meaning. And slowly, Apple began to shine again. The products, the team, the world, they all reflected a man who had learned through pain. Steve Jobs was different, not smaller, not weaker, but deeper, stronger, wiser. And this time, success wasn't fleeting. It was built on lessons learned the hard way. By the early 2000s, Apple was no longer just a company. It had become a symbol of innovation, of simplicity, of thinking differently. And behind it all was Steve Jobs, a man shaped by failure more than fame. The iMac, the iPod, the beginnings of the iPhone and iPad, products that changed the way people worked, learned, and played. But the real story wasn't just the devices. It was the transformation of a man. Steve had learned that failure is not the opposite of success. It is part of the journey. He had been humbled, broken, and rebuilt, and that made his vision sharper, his leadership wiser. People followed him not out of fear, but out of trust. They believed in his ideas because they carried experience, patience, and clarity. Steve also found peace in creation. Money no longer defined him. Recognition no longer ruled him. Instead, it was the quiet satisfaction of seeing something he dreamed of come to life. Apple became more than a company. It became a legacy, a reflection of what one man's persistence, imagination, and lessons from failure could achieve. Even in his personal life, Steve began to appreciate simplicity and presence. He understood that life, like technology, is fragile, delicate, and fleeting. Looking back, the man who was once thrown out of his own company had built a legacy that would outlast him. Not just in devices, not just in profits, but in the way people think about possibility, creativity, and vision. Failure had been his teacher, and he had listened. Steve showed the world that a person is not defined by setbacks, but by how they respond to them, by how they rise after losing everything, by how they rebuild, wiser, stronger, and calmer than before. Apple was the world's stage, but Steve's real masterpiece was his growth. He turned pain into purpose, loss into insight, failure into a legacy that would inspire generations. And quietly, almost unnoticed, the man who once feared losing everything had created something far greater than he ever imagined. Steve Jobs' story does not end with a loud victory or a dramatic speech. It ends quietly, like a soft breath after a long struggle. He achieved fame. He built Apple into a world-changing company. He created products that people could not imagine living without. But the true lesson is not in the devices. It is in the man who lost everything and found himself again. Failure did not destroy Steve Jobs. It rebuilt him. It taught him patience. It taught him humility. It taught him how to see clearly what truly matters. He learned that success is not permanent, and that loss is not the end. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find yourself. Steve Jobs' life shows that greatness is born not just from talent or vision or intelligence, but from the courage to face failure, embrace it, and grow. And as we look at his story, quietly, in reflection, we see more than a tech genius. We see a human being, fragile, flawed, yet resilient. A man who teaches us that every ending, every fall, every heartbreak can lead to a new beginning. Sometimes it takes losing the world to understand what really matters. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find yourself. And with that quiet understanding, we can start again. Because even in failure, life holds its own kind of beauty. Did Steve Jobs' journey inspire you as much as it inspired me? If his story taught you anything about failure, resilience, or chasing your dreams, hit the like button. And don't forget to subscribe to English Speakcast for more stories that help you learn English while exploring lives that change the world. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear which part of Steve Jobs' story moved you the most. Remember, every story, every failure, and every lesson can help us grow both in life and in English.